The mischief rule. Sorry, Olga, I don't know if you...
Yeah, exactly. That my question was, so we know what is in between. We don't know the other side. So literal rule on one side and mischief rule would be nice to understand.
The mischief rule is more when we look at the intention of the legislation. We obviously still need to look at the words, but we look at what was originally intended by Parliament when creating this. So what we have on the slide is 5 things to consider under Hayden's case. This is what judges will look at. So what was the law previously before this piece of legislation? So whatever previous legislation existed or how this was reflected in common law. What is the defect in the current legislation that we're trying to overcome? What remedy had Parliament intended? And what is the purpose behind that remedy? What are we trying to do with a particular remedy or sentence in criminal law? This was actually developed a little bit further in 1980 in another case called Jones v. Rotham Park, with some more considerations. So things we need to be able to determine are whether or not it's possible to establish the intended mischief that Parliament had tried to avoid by making the legislation. It needs to be clear as well to the judge that Parliament had failed to properly address that mischief in the way they drafted their legislation. And thirdly, it needs to be possible to actually identify what new wording could be inserted or what principles could be established to avoid the mischief that Parliament had intended.
So, and the last one on the list is purposive approach or purposive rule, as per purpose. So how is it different from mischief then? So
I would say approach is broader than rule. Rule is simply a rule that we're applying. The approach is how we're approaching the problem. So a purposive approach, we're going in with the objective of applying the purpose that Parliament had when creating a piece of legislation. It's not quite the same as the rule itself. This case here is a good illustration actually of that. In the Ramsey case, there was a company that had repeatedly created artificial losses in terms of for capital gains tax. They'd created these artificial losses through legitimate accounting practices. And the decision in the case was effectively that they hadn't necessarily, on a literal interpretation of the law, done anything that would be illegal, but it certainly was against the spirit of the legislation. It was in breach of the mischief that Parliament had intended to prevent. Now, actually, IRC have powers through the General Anti-Abuse Rule to address what would have been the issue in this case. But the interpretation in this case that was adopted, the approach that was taken was to prevent the issue that Parliament had originally hoped to stop.